Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. Tom, I don't know how you're going to top this venue. This is phenomenal. The hotel, a great place to be on the island. Brian's right. We've been doing a little bit of a road show and trying to get this message out. And I'll spend a couple of minutes here talking about ERCOT, just for those of you who aren't intimately familiar with us. We operate a grid that's kind of wedged between two much bigger grids in the United States and Canada. We're about 70,000 megawatts. I think the one in the east is about, nobody really measures the coincident peak there, was probably 450,000. And in the west, it's probably about 250,000. So we're smaller, and we have very limited ability to move power between the grids. And so when we get in trouble, they can't help us very much. And if they get in trouble, we can't help them very much. Our role as an independent system operator is to keep the lights on in our small grid using market-based mechanisms. So we kind of refer to ourselves as the air traffic controller of the grid. We don't own any of the assets, but we sort of direct the flow of power on the grid, and that's our job. Also to ensure adequate reserves. We're going to talk about that a little bit here. This is a really kind of simplified slide of what we do. If you have to meet the instantaneous load on the grid at all times, that means you have to generate exactly enough power to meet the load every second of every minute of every day. If your generation falls short, your frequency goes low. If you overgenerate, your frequency goes high. And that's our job, is to keep that frequency at exactly 60 hertz. But the key thing that I think the relevant part that I'm going to talk about today is a 1 megawatt reduction of load has exactly the same effect on the grid as a megawatt of increase in generation. That's the kind of part of ERCOT that I work in, and we'll talk about that. And Brian has already showed this slide. I wanted to point out one thing. You know, I think the dotted red line is the one that's most important here. That's really what our target reserve margin is, the reserve margin being probably the most famous number that ERCOT publishes every year. That is what we have installed, that is what we need to meet the load forecast, plus what we need in reserve in case something bad happens. And things happen. You know, units trip offline, maybe the load forecast is off a little bit one day or another. And so you always have to have some power in reserve. The other piece that I think is worth noting here is the light blue that gets increasingly large in the out years. Those are power plants that are not built yet. These are power plants that have interconnection agreements with the transmission operator, but they may not be funded yet, and they may not get. Some of them may not get built. Many of them will, and Brian's detailed a lot of that. But just to let you know, the only resources that we really know are coming online or that are going to be there are the ones that are in dark blue. There could be a financial decision not to. So this is the challenge that we have, is to try to keep grid reliability intact in an era of uncertainty as we go forward. And the other thing is, you will notice our load continues to grow. It's a good thing for the economy, but it's a challenge for the grid operator. This is a look at our peak day. We spent a lot of time talking about 2011, but our peak day was August 3rd, which was unusual. It's usually a little later in August, but we just had really super hot weather that week. The peak would have been August 4th, but we'll talk about that in a minute. We deployed all of our demand response resources that day, and that kept the peak load down a little bit. This is the fuel mix that we use, that the system uses to meet that load. You can see the nuclear and the coal at the bottom. They're pretty much running full out all the time. There's a little bit of hydro, very little bit of hydro. We import mentioned we have a little bit of ability to import power from the neighboring grids. That's what those DC tie imports look like. You can see the wind blowing at night, dying down in the middle of the day, picking up a little bit in the afternoon, probably related to coastal wind south of where we are. And then the big blob at the top is all different types of natural gas-fired power plants. There's a pretty big delta there, 28,000 megawatt difference between off-peak and on-peak. So I'm going to do something a little dorky here, but if you've seen this slide before and you're in this room, could you raise your hand? Okay, I've got some work to do, but that's good, about maybe 15, 20%. So I'm going to talk about this slide a little bit. This is who's using all that power. So on the left, you have a usage of 15 minutes. This is a 15-minute settlement interval in ERCOT. And this is back in March of 2011. We picked probably the mildest. I wanted to pick a mild day when you really don't have a lot of what we call air conditioning, I guess, driven load. You'll notice the large commercial and industrial, those are the big industrial plants. They're pretty flat, and they pretty much remain unchanged from one day to the next. Small commercial, about 29% of the load. Residential is about 8,500 megawatts and about 27% of the load. Then fast forward a few months, about 5 months later, same time of day. This was August 3rd. This was our peak day. Temperature in Dallas was 109 as compared to 64 degrees on the earlier day. Residential has suddenly become 51% of our total. What we're talking about here is a whole lot of air conditioners running, and that's what really drives these peaks. The peaks are what drives ERCOT reliability, and it's what drives investment in the market, and that's what drives a lot of what we do. Here's another way of looking at that too, by the way. This is, I was able to get this slide from our friends at the Pecan Street Project, but this is an average load during this summer at one household over a period of a week. And you'll see, this is pretty not unusual. This is during the summer, so you've got low load during the morning, and it goes up in the afternoon. But the top row is the whole house load. That's the entire load for everything in the house. The blue line underneath it is the air conditioner, okay? A pretty good illustration of what's driving. By the way, the little ones at the bottom, one of them is the refrigerator, and the other one is all your cooking. So there's not, just the order of magnitude of what's driving electrical usage in the state. So we, some of y'all may have heard about the Rattle Group report. We hired a really good think tank to kind of come down and assess all of this, and they've provided a lot of really good information to the commissioners and to ERCOT and the market participants, laying out some of the options that we have for meeting all of these challenges in the coming years. And the demand response, which is what I'm going to talk about the rest of my presentation here, plays a pretty prominent role in the report. I'm not going to read all this, but I put the link here, and if you all want to go read it, it's a good read. Even if you're not living in the world of the electric market every day. I'm not going to read this either, but these are 3 definitions of demand response. They come from 3 different national organizations: Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and the North American Energy Standards Board. They're a little bit different, but they're all generally say this. A simplified version of it is demand response is somebody changing their load in response to some kind of a signal. The signal is usually going to be economic. It could be in the form of a price, or it could be an instruction, for example, from ERCOT or from your load-serving entity or whomever. So it's moving. It's turning off load. It's moving the thermostat up a few degrees. It may be shutting something off at the breaker. So DR is a often misunderstood concept. So I kind of think of it as kind of a Baskin-Robbins store. It's, comes in a lot of different shapes and sizes. We run wholesale market demand response products at ERCOT. We run ancillary services markets every day, which are part of those operating reserves that we talked about. We've had very active demand response participation in those for over a decade now. We're out front of most of the rest of the world in our ability to have loads participate in our ancillary services markets. We also run a product called ERS, or Emergency Response Service. That's open to loads of all sizes and shapes. We've had some residential participation in it for the first time this year. These are the products where if you've got load that you can move during an emergency, you need to be represented by a market participant, but you can potentially get a payment for being available to shut off during a tight situation on the grid. In addition, our friends at the Transmission and Distribution Utilities have programs, and there's a panel coming up later today on that. They run energy efficiency programs that also include a component that involves demand response. And that's a way of them meeting the goals that were set forth in the statutes for them to meet their load growth in part through energy efficiency. And we've coordinated with them. They will drop that load during an ERCOT event as well as for their own needs. And we work very closely with those guys. Combined between ERS and the TDSP programs, we had about 650 megawatts this summer of load under contract. So it's good, it's growing. It's not growing maybe as fast as we would like, but it is growing. And then finally, there's a lot of what I'm going to call retail demand response, and that's going to be something like a contract or an agreement that the customer has with the load-serving entity, which would be your retail electric provider, or if you may live in a co-op or a municipally owned utility. It's in some way either rewards you for turning off during certain periods or allows them to turn you off during certain periods, or may be just simply a price signal. In addition, by the way, I was mentioned this, but if you were paying attention and heard this on the radio, 14 times last summer, we coordinated with the commission and asked people voluntarily to help us through some tight times. We didn't have to do that I think maybe we did do it a couple of days in late June. We had a hot weather siege this summer. It's a pretty interesting comparative year, and I know Brian alluded to this. You always kind of worry about, when you have a relatively mild summer following something like 2011, that there will be complacency setting in. I don't think that's been the case this year. I think we've been fortunate. I think the rattle report put a lot of really important information on the table, and I think everybody is still focused on this. But if we have 2 or 3 years of mild weather and we don't have any more emergency events, I'm always a little worried that this will recede into people's memories. So far, I haven't seen any evidence of that, though, so I think everybody's pretty focused on a long-term solution. I wanted to talk a minute about retail DR. There's really 2 different business cases in our market, and this is something that I wrestle with on a daily basis. We're in Galveston today. We're in an area that's served by CenterPoint, and it's open to competitive choice. So if you live here, or if you live in Houston or Dallas or Corpus Christi, you're getting one of those retail electric provider offers that Brian talked about, and you're getting marketed pretty heavily. On the other hand, if you lived in Austin like I do, or if you live in San Antonio, or you live in one of the co-ops, you have a long-term relationship with your muni or your co-op, and they know that they will have you as a customer for long-term. It creates a hugely different business case when you're talking about products that might encourage or incentivize people to reduce load or to provide demand response. We've seen a lot of very encouraging signs. San Antonio has a major project. Brian mentioned their solar project, but they've also got a major residential and small commercial demand response rollout going on with very ambitious goals. It's a more difficult challenge in the retail market, especially because it's very competitive. It's partly we're a victim of our own success. The competition means you don't get to own that customer for very long, and that kind of dilutes the incentives to maybe install some equipment and help them become price responsive or demand response. I wanted to finish by saying, we've historically in ERCOT have had a bit of a challenge prior to our nodal market, I guess, which launched in 2010. We didn't always have wholesale prices that actually aligned with grid reliability challenges. We fixed that. I think we've largely fixed it. There are still a few initiatives underway to make sure that prices are supported and price formation occurs during during the times that ERCOT has to use a command and control mechanism. But for the most part, we have high prices during periods of scarcity. So that means the economic incentives and the reliability incentives have lined up. That's a good thing. We want to continue that. We want to promote that and continue to perfect it. This has already had a good impact in the commercial and industrial sector. A lot of price responsive loads in the industrial sector are already doing this, and they're very sophisticated. Where we need to go is where we need to make more inroads is with the residential and small commercial customers. We have laid the foundation for that. We have done it with, through statute and commission orders on advanced metering. That data is the foundation for the smart grid and the foundation for this. It's growing a little slower than I would like, but it's growing. And that is all I had, and I know we're maybe running a little behind, Tom, but I'll be around too if anybody has any questions. This is my contact info. Happy to take any emails from you folks at any time. And I, again, appreciate the chance to be here.